Hello, this is Ed Sullivan, editor of Building Operating Management magazine. Thanks for joining us for today's webcast, Giving Elevators a Lift. Our presenter today is Preston Humbrook. For the past 5 years, Preston has been the Director of Sales for Ascend Elevator Protection Systems at Inpro. He graduated from UNC Wilmington with an Operations and Production Management degree. He was brought on the Inpro team to launch and manage this startup division and has been involved from the initial concept. Prior to joining Inpro, Preston worked for ThyssenKrupp Elevator as a service and repair account manager. He has personally been involved in elevator projects spanning the country and has a vast network of elevator industry professionals, including owners, sales reps, consultants, mechanics, inspectors, and installation partners. Today's webcast learning objectives include: explore the factors driving the need for elevator cab interior renovation, examine the various codes and standards impacting a cab renovation project, identify the material and design options for cab walls, trims, hardware, ceilings, and lighting. Assess the key installation considerations to reduce elevator downtime. Before we get started with the webcast, I'd like to cover a few details about today's event. A live question and answer session will follow the presentation. To submit questions, please use the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen and send your questions to all panelists. Our presenter will answer as many as time permits. At the conclusion of today's webcast, you will receive a PDF copy of the presentation slides. You will also receive a link to a brief online assessment. Upon successful completion of this assessment, you will receive your CEU certificate. Today's webcast will also be archived at facilitiesnet.com/webcasts. And now, a brief word from our sponsor.
Founded in 1979, Inpro is a global provider of high-performance, design-forward architectural products for building professionals. Based in Muskego, Wisconsin, Inpro makes and services products with an obsessive commitment to protecting buildings and the well-being of people who use them. Inpro's product categories include door and wall protections, washroom systems, expansion joint systems, privacy, elevator protection, architectural signage, and commercial window treatments.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Preston.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we will go ahead and jump right in. This one's going to be about giving elevators a lift, cab interior retrofits and major renovation projects. So this is copyright material. This presentation is protected by U.S. and international copyright laws. Reproduction, distribution, display, and use of the presentation without written permission of Inpro Corporation is prohibited. So please don't steal it from us. Course description. So when someone's considering a major building renovation, it's very easy for us to focus on spaces like the corridors, the lobbies, the offices, guest or patient rooms, more so all the public-facing spaces. We would argue that right after the lobby, a building's elevators are the very next most public-facing space that the building occupants and visitors see. So this course is going to lay out the case for the cab renovations as part of an overall building interior update. After all, the elevators are interiors too, so we don't want to forget about that small space that can have a big impact. The learning objectives today, we're going to explore the factors driving the need for elevator cab interior renovations. We'll examine the various codes and standards impacting a cab renovation project, identify the material and design options for cab walls, the trims, hardware, ceiling, and lighting options, and we will assess the key installation considerations to reduce elevator downtime. So why renovate elevator cabs? Sometimes it's for safety concerns, it's better lighting, there's damaged areas, different trends, branding. Sometimes it's just time for an update. So in the U.S. and Canada, there are approximately now about 1.2 million elevators, and each elevator carries on average 20,000 people a year, so a total of 20 billion passenger trips annually. According to the National Elevator Industry, the average rise of an elevator is 4 to 5 floors, so about 40 feet. Add all those numbers up, and this means elevators travel 1.36 billion miles per year. That's more than 2,700 trips to the moon and back. So as Indiana Jones said, it's not the years, it's the mileage, but we would argue it's the mileage and the years. So one of the main reasons to consider a cab interior renovation is due to the general wear and tear that they face every day. So let's think about passenger elevators. You find these in office buildings, hotels, hospitals, casinos, universities, and dorms. And people are in and out of these every day with book bags, suitcases, rolling carts, moving different materials around, sometimes receiving packages. So lots of different things that can cause eventual damage to an elevator, not to mention those who are just bored or anxious, who can't keep their hands to themselves. Vandalism is always a challenge for elevators. For some reason, those doors close and people tend to lose control. I don't know why everybody has the desire to want to carve their name and leave their mark on the world, but we'll leave that up to them. Other ones, you have the same kind of wear and tear in service elevators. So think your patient gurneys coming in and out, heavy portable diagnostic equipment, service carts, cleaning carts. All of this equipment can just wreak havoc on an interior. These are areas where extra layers of protection may be needed to kind of help extend the life of the interiors. These types of elevators may also need a different type of material, something a little bit more durable than just a standard panel. We'll get into some of the options a little bit later on in this presentation of what you can look at for those applications. There's also what we consider hybrid elevators. These are more of your office buildings that are constantly shipping and receiving deliveries, college housing, so dormitories that always have the move-in and move-out days. So it's a little bit of both. The elevators serve as both that service elevator as well as a passenger elevator. Think about how many times you're in a hotel and you see the cleaning staff waiting to use the elevator. It's because they don't have a dedicated service elevator. So these need to kind of have dual purpose and kind of be the best of both worlds. So another reason to renovate the elevator interiors is because, well, styles change. There's changes in colors, there's changes in design trends, and one of the first things people will notice about the elevator is the cab appearance. When most of the other elevator performance equipment is expected to last 15 or more years when installed, the cab interior may need to be changed a couple of times in that same span to keep up with the changes in times. Especially true for those trying to attract or retain different tenants. I know universities are very competitive right now trying to retain students. So a lot of things can kind of drive those additional changes to the elevators. Those trying to make brand awareness or match other interior changes, different paint schemes, maybe due to a standardization. Sometimes it's just because different materials become available and they want to upgrade to the latest and greatest. Making a good first impression. This is kind of what it's all about. Right after that lobby, elevators are often the next space and guests and residents and families will experience. Usually that's the next stop in the building. The first impression of a damaged or a worn-out cab interior may have a direct negative impact on the overall experience of patients and guests. Further, it could translate to their perception of the level of care or service they're about to receive. How many of us have been in one of those elevators where you don't want to touch anything, you just want to get out? You know, what's your first impression of that facility at that point? You know, how does it make you feel? That feeling can be impacted for the whole facility based on something that's about 35 to 45 square feet, and that can be the entire lasting impression that they get from that facility. So it's definitely an area we want to focus on. And another reason is to upgrade the interiors, the riders won't see the mechanical upgrades. So your client may spend millions, hundreds of thousands of dollars is easy on a major renovation. It could just be a couple $1,000s on a new coat of paint or other items just to refresh the decor, but leaving an old, damaged, dark cab out of the renovation budget, it could leave the project with a serious black eye. So if you budget $50,000 or $100,000 on elevator equipment upgrades, riders are not going to notice anything new and are still going to feel like they're trapped in an old elevator. They can't tell you just spent those big bucks replacing a jack or a power unit, controller, door operators, things of those nature that are all behind the scenes. So we need to make sure that we consider both mechanical and interior upgrades whenever we talk about doing those building renovations. So when is a totally new cab recommended? This is pretty rare. It does happen occasionally, but the entire car is beyond its useful life, and you can't just simply repair it or renovate it. Long-term exposure to hard use, harsh environments, rot, corrosion, water damage, these can all lead to a cab enclosure needing to be replaced, basically out of a safety precaution. I remember there was a hospital that I had as an account when I was back at my former employer, and they used to always spray out the elevators. That was their way of cleaning them. So after years and years and years of doing this, the subfloor there on the actual elevator enclosure was rotted. So they went to change out the flooring, realized the damage that they had been doing. They had to replace the entire cab at that point. So it's not something that you're typically going to find in a elevator upgrade, but it is something to be aware of the potential that can happen. So some elevator interior terminology we want to go over before we move into some of the requirements of the ADA and the various codes. We just want to go over these, kind of give that overview. So we'll start. A is the toe kick. You can find that located at the bottom of that picture. This is usually like a stainless steel base that many of the systems are built off of. It's also an area that will provide ventilation in the elevators. So you can kind of see it in that picture. There's some little small dots kind of going across the bottom of that toe kick or the top of that toe kick. Those are ventilation cutouts. So we don't want to restrict the airflow coming through the vents of the cab wall. By code, there's a certain amount of air that has to be able to flow through the interior of that cab. So you want to make sure that you don't impede any of that. Usually it's found right there in the floor. Sometimes it's found in the ceiling. But the toe kick is there with the ventilation. And it also adds as an impact kind of resistant area right next to the floor. So those are typically going to be about 4 to 6 inches in height. It'll have some stiffeners behind it. So anything that crashes into it should help deflect that initial damage. Moving up, B, that's going to be your panel options. So most likely if you're looking to update the interior of your cab, you are going to use some sort of panel system. When choosing which system to go with, it's important to note what makes a panel durable. Some panels, the more durable ones, are going to be fully wrapped in the wall protection. They'll have some beveled edges to kind of help deflect that damage. That's some of the most important things to look for if you're just kind of comparing different types of panels. Some are going to have more of a banded edge, and that's where your first line of defense on a panel is. If a banded edge kind of peels off, then it becomes a pick point. People start peeling at it more. Well, now you've exposed that whole panel to damage, and that's where you can get the delamination, and the panels can start chipping and peeling and cracking. So we want to make sure that we protect those panels as much as we can. We'll move up to the top of the picture. C, that's going to be your ceiling, your lighting options. Pretty self-explanatory there. When it comes to the ceilings, you can choose from several different configurations in cabs. The main purpose of the ceiling is obviously to provide lighting. A well-lit cab provides safety for riders, can help reduce slips, trips, and falls, whereas a dark one, you're going to have the adverse. It's not going to be as safe for the riders. It can give riders actually anxiety. But with the right lighting, your cab can appear a lot safer. It can appear a lot cleaner. And nowadays, with the LED lights, it becomes a lot more eco-friendly and more green, so you can kind of get those building credits also in your elevator. D, the handrails. So the handrails are more than just a bar that's used for support for riders. It also acts as a damage defender. So think about everything kind of coming into an elevator, whether it's a cart or a hospital bed or something else. That's going to have enough standoff, or that's actually going to use the first kind of impact part of the cab. So that's going to use it as a deflection into the cab. If you look at the ends of the handrails, you have a couple different options, whether it be a straight end or a bent end or returned end handrail. I would typically recommend a returned end handrail whenever you're looking at an upgrade or just a simple replacement. That being that it reduces snag points in the elevator. So a woman's purse walks in, gets caught. There's cords dangling on like an IV machine. You don't want those to get caught around a handrail. So if you kind of return those back to the cab wall itself, it can help reduce the snags. And it also does work as a deflection versus it being a straight end that's going to bear the brunt of that impact. A bent one will kind of deflect that into the cab and kind of reduce that overall impact to the wall. It's all about the longevity of the cab. E, those are the reveals. This is pretty standard in all elevators. You're going to see the reveals in between panels. Most of the time it's just recessed strips of stainless steel. It can be a painted wall even, but for the most part, that's just there to conceal some of the fasteners of a panel clip system. And moving up to the top again, F, that is what is called a freeze. That's basically the top component, kind of matches the toe kick. It can also be ventilated, but that just kind of completes the cab and once again closes off any exposed screw heads, anything like that, so that no one can access the panels themselves because we don't want anybody to be able to remove them. We're zooming. Sorry about that. So moving into some of the codes and standards, this is not going to cover every elevator interior code, as that will vary depending on what year code your local jurisdiction follows. So, for example, Seattle, Washington, they have a code there that you have to have tubular round handrails on all walls, but if you move across the country, that's not going to be the case. So I'm here located in the Carolinas, that's not the code here. So this is just a brief primer on the elevator codes and standards. Always good to check with your local jurisdiction to make sure that you are in compliance. So ADA requirements, the guide to ADA standards. So we want to call your attention to the fact that the American with Disabilities Act has specific language regarding accommodation within the elevators and the surrounding elevator landing space. So pay special attention to required compliance, Chapter 2, Section 206.6, and Chapter 4, Section 407. Then we'll get into destination-oriented elevators and existing elevator alterations as well. So when making alterations to existing elevators, if a multiple bank is involved, changing one car may mean all cars in the elevator bank may need to be altered per the ADA guide, Section 407. So what that means, if there's elevators are linked, so you're standing in a lobby, you push the hall call, the button to actually summon the elevator to come to you. If you're not sure what elevator that represents, that's going to be a lobby, that's going to be a bank of elevators. So you might have 2, 3, 4, you could have up to 6 or 8, even more so linked to that one call button. So if you change one, you're going to have to change the rest of them because they're all going to have to be in that same kind of ADA compliance. So the one on the left can't meet it and the one on the right not meet it. So that's kind of what that one states. Same thing now with alterations because of a building remodel. Changes to the accessibility based on a building remodel. Certain alterations or additions to a facility may trigger the requirement for an accessible route between floors. You're not going to be able to just shut it down and not allow access for someone with mobility disadvantages. Some of the other ADA requirements, alterations in compliance with finished internal dimensions. When you're remodeling an elevator cab or entrance, you need to pay particular attention to the finished dimensions of both to remain in compliance and avoid any post-construction inspection red flags. So if you're changing the interior, make sure the new material that you're applying to the walls will not impede those clearance requirements. If there were no panels on the existing wall and you go in there with a 3/4-inch thick panel on every side, you've just eaten in another 1.5 inches of your usable wall space or floor space on that total layout, so you're really starting to get into it. If you already had a small or kind of older cab, it's just something you really want to make sure that you are aware of, especially with some of the different looks and materials out there now. Really make sure that you're staying in compliance with these things. You don't want to go through this whole process and then you have an elevator inspector come out there and he puts a tape to it and now you've got to disassemble the whole cab. So the elevator code is ASME 17.1, 2016. This code it applies to all the new installations only, except Part 1 sections. You can see 5.1, 8.1, 8.6 through on 8.11. Those apply to both new and existing installs. But once again, you need to check to see what code your jurisdiction operates under. It varies city to city sometimes. So it's your best interest to know what you're working with. That's really the most important thing there because every place can be so different. But this one, however, is not. This one's pretty standard across the country. So this is kind of the golden 5% rule when you're dealing with weights of the cab and load testing. So after the renovation of a cab, it cannot weigh more or less than 5% of its previous weight. So what that means, you have the dead weight of the actual cab. So this is the materials itself that make up the elevator enclosure. So for this example, we're going to say that weighs 3,000 pounds. Then you have the actual capacity weight. So usually you'll see that on a placard inside the car that'll say it's a 2,000 pound or a 2,500 or whatever it is. So you're going to take the dead weight plus the capacity, and that's going to give you that total weight that you're allowed to change that 5%. So in this example, 3,000 pound dead weight, 2,000 pound capacity, so you've got 5,000 pounds. Take 5% of it, you've got 250 pounds that you're allowed to alter that cab, either plus or minus. Some states may require additional load testing regardless, anytime there's a cab alteration done. Colorado, California for sure, they always require that cab to be done a load test, and what that means is they're going to put the capacity of the cab plus 25% extra weight, and they're going to do what's called crashing the car. All they're doing is tripping the safeties to make sure that if that cab is fully loaded, it can stop on the way down. But this is standard across the country. This is one of the ones that, depending on what you're doing, you're going to weigh the material coming out of the cab. If you're kind of concerned about the weight, you have to know what material weight came out, what material weight goes in to make sure you stay in compliance. So the fire ratings. The elevator code states that a minimum Class B fire rating for materials must be met. Once again, some jurisdictions, like New York City, for instance, they have a lot more stringent flame and smoke spread requirements. So once again, just reiterating that point to check with your local jurisdiction. But all materials must be fire tested in their in-use configuration. The walls, the ceilings, the flooring, and it has to be tested as a unit. So if you have a wall panel, you can't just put what's going over the core. You have to test it in that finished state. So the wood panel, the laminate material, and the substrate or whatever adhesive is used all must be tested together so that you can achieve that correct fire rating. So the cab ventilation code. Once again, the ASME A17.1, this is the standard elevator code. It stipulates that the natural ventilation must be around 3.5%, or at least 3.5% of the floor area. And that's usually accomplished with the ventilation fans and toe kick ventilation slots. If you go into a cab, most of the time you'll be able to see them in the floor or in the ceiling. Sometimes it comes through behind the panels for certain cabs. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. Also, it's not for dogs and electric fans, even though those are cuter as we have here. But during your renovation, you want to make sure you don't cover up vents in any circumstances. That could lead, if they come in and inspect it and they can't find the ventilation, they will make you drill holes and provide the proper ventilation, or they can close your elevator down and say it doesn't meet code and you're dead in the water. So no one wants to deal with that headache. Moving on with tamper resistance. So the panels must be designed so that they cannot be removed with common tools. It's pretty straightforward. We don't want people to remove panels in the elevator. Have you ever noticed the car operating panel? So this is the push-button controls wherever you're trying to select your floor. That's called the car operating panel, or COP. It'll be referred to as that. But they're always fastened with security screws. So you're not going to find any Phillips or flathead screws. They don't want this to be removed with common tools. The point being, obviously, we don't want somebody tampering with key systems or the controls or components, because I'm sure in today's world, if they can access the COP, there will probably be an app that would let you download how to reprogram all the floors. So you'd get on the elevator, press the 4th floor, and you're going to end up in the basement or the penthouse. It's going to take you an hour to figure out where you're going. We don't want that to happen. So we try to prevent it as much. Lighting code. So cabs must have at least 2 bulbs, period. You can't operate with just a single bulb. Passenger elevators must have a minimum illumination of 50 lux or 5-foot candle. Lights should be properly mounted and shielded to prevent breakage. An emergency light should provide 2 lux or 0.2-foot candles with enough backup power to run 2 bulbs for 4 hours. This all has to do in the event, the power goes out. It needs to kind of have that emergency so that people aren't just left in the dark, literally. So now let's look at cab interior, the wall materials, and some different design choices. We have high-impact wall panels we'll look at. We'll look at different metal panels, some durable printed graphics, and we'll get into some of the other accessories and kind of trim components like the handrails, the toe kicks, the wall guards. Aesthetics and durability. So there doesn't have to be a trade-off anymore. The best of both worlds can be achieved. So yes, what we're saying is you can have your cake and eat it too. I know in years past there always hasn't been the most options. In the last probably 5-10 years, there's just a lot of different things on the market now that really can make your cab stand out, but also offer the protection that everybody wants. Everybody wants it to look good. They want it to last. But before we jump into the materials, let's just quickly address the cost considerations. When it comes to interiors, you are really looking at kind of 2 different options. You can go with a stock material kit or system versus a pure custom cab. A stock kit is usually going to be less expensive, but it still can offer some customization. So you can add different colors, different dimensions, different layouts. You can add pictures and designs. And a pure custom cab is going to be exactly that. It's pretty much going to be built to fit that cab exactly. Custom cabs are typically going to have longer lead times. They're going to have a little bit more downtime, and they're most likely going to have a lot more cost associated with them in the end. So just 2 kind of ways. You just got to know your facility and what's going to be the best bet for them. So back to materials. The high-impact wall panels. So these panels are made to take abuse. Think about your areas that kind of we mentioned before where lots of things are crashing into them. So those hospitals, the hotels with the carts and equipment. These panels are completely sealed, so they're not going to have any exposed wood core. They're not going to have a banded edge to them. As we mentioned before, the banded edge, as soon as that goes, that whole panel is exposed to further damage. So you really want to make sure those edges are protected. Because once people see it, they're going to pick at it and they're going to pull it, and that panel's done. How many of you have been in an elevator, you look down at the corner of one of the panels, and half the laminate's gone. The panel may be chipped or broken, cracked. That's because they're having those banded edges, and they don't have a way of protecting those edges. So be careful when you're looking at what type of material. Really look at that environment and think what's going to be the best for this cab. And it might only be at the lower level. It might be need 36 inches and down. I need a little bit more protection. On the upper side of the cab, there's not going to be as much damage. That's typically how it goes, but it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. So metals, nowadays there are several different metal options. There's even metals with different colors that we can use in elevators now. So metals can offer that sleek European-style look, or you can get into some of the different textures and you might have more of an industrial look. So sometimes those textures are also added to also kind of further prevent the scratches. A lot of people will hear stainless steel and they're like, oh man, stainless steel is super durable. Yeah, well, it depends on which one you're getting. If you're going with just a number 4 brushed or a mirror finish, that's not going to be your best option if you're worried about scratching. You can walk into any of those, and you hit a number 4 brush with basically like a paper clip, and it'll scratch it. So you're going to want to look at that environment again. What are the risks of damage? What kind of impact is it taking before you make that selection? Metals obviously are going to be a little bit more expensive than just your standard kind of laminate panels, your vinyl panels. But just know that there are several different metal options and help that facility make that best selection. If it's a hospital, I would not recommend just putting number 4 brushed around the bottom of the cab. It's going to get scratched up before you walk off site. That's just how that environment's going to work. So there are some other material options. You've got glass out there. You've got real wood. You've got stone. We've seen solid surface. I've seen just natural mirrors. I've seen tiled walls. I've seen carpet in elevators. I would not recommend any of those. But kind of move back to the glass. These materials are typically going to be seen more in your kind of desire for that higher-end decor, and there's no argument there. I mean, these are going to be absolutely beautiful cabs. They're going to have a lot more kind of flair to them. They're also going to have a lot bigger price tag with them. Some other things to kind of bear in mind, what we just mentioned earlier with the weight. Stone can be extremely heavy, so remember that 5% rule. You could spec out the cab, and the owner comes back and says, I want to do away with whatever the floor is, and I want to put in this marble floor. Well, you're going to need to break out that calculator and go back to the drawing board because you're most likely going to exceed that weight limit. Move over to the real wood. It's probably not going to stand up to your normal wear and tear, and if it does, it's going to be highly likely that it becomes scratched, gouged in several different areas. So now you're going to have to look at maintenance costs and maintaining to keep up those panels. So whether that's a painter's time or whatever, but you're increasing your labor and your maintenance cost based off your cab selection. Glass is another one. I mean, it has the weight to it. Starting to see a little bit more glass kind of come in the market. But a couple things to be careful on. You need to make sure that glass is code compliant and it is the right kind of tempered glass. Another thing to consider with any of these options is going to be the replacement costs down the road. So it might be great today, but what happens when that glass panel breaks in a few years, in a year, whatever it is, you've got a lot higher replacement cost than if you'd have went with more of a impact wall panel. But I know every situation will be different, but just some things to bear in mind when making those material selections. So we'll move into some of the other design choices. Let's first look at these handrails and wall guards. So we addressed earlier some of the codes with handrails. You need to clarify with your jurisdiction, obviously, whether you're allowed to have only round or flat. You also need to know about the height. Most of the time it's going to be very similar to the ADA requirements. It's going to be somewhere in that 32, 34-inch above finished floor. But the handrails, aside from the stability, they also add that comfort level. People get in there, they'll kind of lean on them. But it's more so, think about those who truly do need it for that support. You've probably all been in an elevator where it's kind of jerky, either on the start or the stop. Well, some of our people who are a little bit older, some of the elderly patients at different facilities, they need something that they can actually hold on to help reduce those falls. I mean, that's the last thing you want is somebody to get hurt in your elevator just because we didn't think through what we needed to put in there. So make sure that you do. I would always recommend that you put at least one handrail in the cab. Elevator code doesn't actually state that you have to have a handrail in it, but once again, different jurisdictions will dictate that, as well as if you're trying to meet an ADA requirement for the building. So for a wall guard, or what some people call a bumper rail or a crash rail, this is essentially the exact same piece as a handrail. It's just positioned lower in the cab. So it also does work as additional protection, as we mentioned with the handrails, but a crash rail is specifically for that. Think about the times when you've been in an elevator and you've kind of seen that scratch that goes all the way around the bottom. It might be 10 inches tall or 12 inches tall, wherever it is, but some kind of equipment or cart is hitting it, and it's basically made its way all the way around the cab. This is an ideal situation when you're going to upgrade to put in a crash rail. You already know that something's kind of hitting in that area. You might as well add in a crash rail, prolong the life of that cab, and keep it at its kind of best look that you can. You don't want to put in a brand new cab knowing that it has that area of concern. You don't address it, and a week later you start to see those same scratches again. So be conscious of what the existing cab is and kind of look for any of those problem areas so that you can address it when you're doing your design. Toe kicks, once again, we talked about this at the base. It is not just a decorative piece. It is ventilated for that cab requirement. And I wanted to show you these two pictures so you can kind of see on the one on the left, some people will put that crash rail onto the panel probably depending on where that damage is occurring. But you could also put it right through the toe kick. Really just depends on what your look that you're trying to achieve is. The disadvantage of putting it through the panel is you can't just replace that panel as easy. You're going to have to re-drill another panel if you had to replace it for some reason. Whereas the picture on the right, if one of those panels is damaged, you can just replace that one panel. You're not going to have to worry about re-drilling a crash rail in. But really it's your choice or the owner's choice of what look they're trying to achieve. So trims and reveals. Once again, this is basically to conceal the fasteners of a clip system. The stainless steel kind of adds a finished look to the cab. The painted ones, people will do that if it's just a like-for-like panel replacement. They might just put it onto a painted black steel wall. I've seen some cabs with chair molding around them. I've seen them with cove base put in them. But those reveals really kind of help separate the panels, and it keeps it with a nice uniform look if it's installed correctly. So some other design options can include supporting the brand. Branding has become a very strong trend in the elevator industry. It's one of the most front-facing spaces, as we've talked about, so people are always in and out of this. I always say, think about how many times you go into an elevator when you're staying at a hotel. You're in and out constantly, whether you're coming home for the day, leaving for the day, going down to breakfast, going to the pool, going to work out. You're in that elevator multiple times, except for those of you who take the stairs. Good for you. Be healthy. But for the people who really are looking at how can I capitalize on my brand, put a logo in that elevator. Nothing can kind of really help it stand out more than imagery and logos. We're seeing this in a lot of healthcare companies that are buying out other facilities, and they're kind of expanding that brand. So they're kind of becoming that standardization throughout the healthcare facilities. Same thing with the education facilities. When you're in an all-time high for competitiveness trying to get and retain students, it's just another way to kind of show school pride. Also the high visibility areas. So think some of the mainstays on that campus, some of those buildings where all the donors are coming through. They really want those areas to impress. That's where they're taking students through the tours, trying to get them to come here. So it's all about that impression of, man, what a transformation from an old dark cab to now you have one that's full of light, full of a clean look, and then you have this prominent logo in the back. It's really an impactful picture. Same thing with printed wall protection. You can add a little bit of fun and flair and continue a decor or theme throughout one. This particular picture was at Cook's Children's Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas. Every elevator at that facility, they wanted a different theme for it. So this one was supposed to be the hats theme. So they can create whatever image they want, and you can turn it into a reality inside the elevator. The graphics can be printed on an extremely durable material, so that you actually cannot scratch that picture. It's on more of a back-printed material. You can also use the graphics for like wayfinding. You could use imagery within the elevator to mark a certain building or location. So there's a lot of different options you have now with elevator interiors and what all you can do with them. So some other interior options for new elevators. Just remember, you have the options. You do not have to use the elevator manufacturer cab interior. You own the elevator. You can dictate what you want, as long as it's code compliant, obviously. But they can be purchased from a variety of different vendors or via bid, but you can specify what you want. Just kind of don't let them mislead you in that, hey, here's your three options. You have to pick one of these three, because that's not the case. That's your elevator. You can design it kind of how you want. Write specs for it. We've seen a kind of a trend in including a quote number for what you want in the bid itself. It kind of helps reduce the ways that they can flip a spec or go ahead and say that they're quoting a like for like, because they actually don't know what they're quoting. They just have a quote number to go off of. So just a couple hints of how to help you get the look that you want. So let's go over some ceiling and lighting options. ceiling panel materials. So many times stainless steel is going to be your most common material that you see nowadays. It could still inserts, like so those panels right there that you see on that picture is just an insert into a black welded steel frame ceiling. So you can do that. Excuse me. Some of the older style, you might see that they have those plastic translucent panels, plastic frames, they call it like an egg crate material. Those are older, dated. You can still find that material, but it's not very common at all. Most everybody is upgrading to stainless steel, or it might be a wood core with some sort of laminate, usually a faux metal, or an aluminum. Also, we see those as well. So that's going to be really your standard ceiling options, which kind of takes us into your LED options. You can get different configurations with the cabs. So the one on the left is called an island ceiling, which is more of a grid format, kind of what you see in an office building. The middle one is called a pan ceiling. So depending on the size, it will be 1 pan, 2 pan, 3 pan. And then on the far right, you have a stainless steel, stainless steel insert panel into a black welded steel frame. So those are going to be your three most common ceilings that you're going to see whenever you're going through your options. Obviously, there are some custom ceilings you can have made. There's perimeter light ceilings as well if you want more of a softer light going around the edges. There's also fixtures where people can make it almost more like a lamp. You just want to make sure that you're meeting those light requirements it's strong enough to get to the floor and meet that code requirement. Security upgrades. You've all probably seen these. You have cameras. That can help catch mischief and illegal activities. It can help deter vandalism. I'm sure we've all seen some of the videos from incidents in years past of some of the celebrities and athletes that were caught red-handed in an elevator not doing what they were supposed to do. So they can definitely help with that. I know several universities use these, and if they have a problem area in the dorms where the kids are doing a lot of vandalism, that can help deter it. Or they'll have whoever did it captured on camera, on them until they pay for the elevator damages, because everything is not free and inexpensive like they sometimes think. The card readers, obviously, this is to help limit the access to certain floors and keep people safe. Most of the time, you're going to see it in a lot of hotels. Best access to who can go to what floors. You also see it in hospitals and office buildings. Hospitals, you might have to have a key to get to the labor and delivery floor. A lot of times, that's a high security area that they don't want anybody and everybody to access. And last but not least, the installation considerations to consider. So we're going to go over some of the differences in cab construction. You see it listed here, steel and wood shell. What this is where you're going to have panels that are usually attached to complete the interior look. So that's going to be the actual substrate or finished wall material is going to be of whatever material, wood or steel, and you're going to have panels that are applied to that. So that's more of a simple kind of change out where you're going to take panels off, put panels back on. If we look at a stud shell or a stick frame cab, sometimes it's called a skeleton cab, or studded out is usually what the other one you really hear. But you see that in the picture. It looks basically like you're framing a house. It's just those studs. The issue with that is that space in between the panels. So you're going to have, how do I best explain this one to you? That panel kind of sits down in between those two studs. So it's exposed to the hoistway behind it. A lot of codes are actually moving to, if they have or they encounter these interiors, when they go to do an upgrade, you have to completely seal off that shaft. They don't want anybody to be able to stick a hand behind a panel and reach into the hoistway. Obviously, that's a huge safety concern, and you could have a lot of problems if somebody did that. It is an area of concern when you find these cabs, just because if you don't know it ahead of time, it could add a little bit of downtime, and you're going to have to come back to a job site to address those certain configurations. Whereas if you had the steel or the wood shell walls, I mean, you're going to see that a lot more. You'll see this in some older cabs. For some reason, I see these out a lot at the coast, but that's really just that's the one to be most concerned about when you find it, just because it entails a little bit more work. The shell cab enclosure, these are elevators where the finished wall actually acts as the interior. So it could be just a vinyl or laminate or a stainless steel, but there is nothing else to remove. The wall itself is the cab wall. So knowing that, the cab construction matters, when it comes to renovations. If it's a shell cab enclosure like we just talked about, you might not, I apologize, you might not have any changes to the wall panels that you can really do, because you'll be adding too much weight potentially. If you exceed that 5%, there is still a way to have that cab rebalanced. You may have to add or take away counterweights, or have the cab or service provider come out there and kind of do a re-engineering of the elevator. Once again, you're just getting into more money, so if you can avoid that, do so. So that's where it's good to know those weight restrictions and alongside of the cab construction. Another way, if you come across a shell renovation and you don't have any materials that you're taking off, you could look at just applying sheet material. So whatever that vinyl you want to go back with or laminate you're going back with, you could essentially just apply that right over the wall. You're not going to add any kind of weight, nothing that would justify any kind of issues with that 5%. And then you might be able to upgrade the handrails or add in a crash rail, do a ceiling. So there's different ways to kind of play around depending on what you see in the elevator market. But once again, just to reiterate, that stick construction is the one that's kind of most troublesome when people come across it. So be aware of what you have, what you're dealing with. Let's talk about the elevator downtime. So who can work on the elevator? We have a lot of times people think that they could just do it themselves. Not quite the case. Sorry, sorry. Whoop, getting click happy over here. You want to make sure, depending on the scope of the project, that whoever's working on the elevator is certified. If it's just a simple cab replacement, you're going to be down for about a day, 2 days, possibly longer depending on what the actual scope of the project is overall. But with the renovation projects, be sure to work with the building owner, set up communication and adequate notice of the outage to the building owners and tenants so that everybody's in the loop. You don't want to catch them off guard and it's going to take 5 days to redo it and they didn't know. They were expecting a day. So it's all about that communication and set those expectations up front. Now the licensed installers and who can do it. If you come across you just want to replace a handrail or you just want to replace panels, this is something that you could potentially do without having to hire somebody, because you're just basically swapping in a panel, swapping the panel back out. You're going to have a wash of the weight. You're not having to access anything in the hoistway, so you don't have near as many factors to consider. Same thing if somebody was just putting in a handrail. That can be done internally in the cab, so you're not going to have to access that hoistway, and it could be a simple replacement. Once again, always check with that jurisdiction. Now moving on to an actual full-blown cab interior upgrade or just considering ceilings. You really don't want that owner to attempt to do it themselves, even if they have an electrician on staff. They need to check with those local and state codes, because you're going to find most of the time you have to have an elevator license. With those ceilings, you have to access the actual hoistway, so you're going to have somebody that's going to get on top of the elevator cab. They're going to need to know what they're doing. If they don't lock out and tag out properly, you're exposing that employee to a lot of risk that's not necessary. And is it worth saving a few bucks to put an employee's life at risk? No. And these accidents can be fatal. What they always say in the elevator industry is the elevators don't have feelings, so they don't care if you get caught between a floor. They're going to keep running. Do not put somebody at risk to save a little bit of money. Do the right thing. Make sure you follow the codes and the laws. And a lot of times you're going to have a door key to access those hoistways anyway. This isn't something you're going to have sitting at Lowe's or Home Depot. So you need to go through the proper channels to get it done. Just to reiterate, if you just want to swap out a panel, okay, you're not altering weight, you're not accessing the hoistway. You can take one off, put one back on if it's just, say, on a Z-clip. But anything outside of that, I would really caution you to know what you're doing and getting into and make sure that you use the proper channels to get that renovation completed. Last tip here is be careful on flooring choices. You need to pay attention to the car operating panel if it's a swing return, so that means that it runs kind of floor to ceiling and will swing out into the elevator cab. If you put in flooring that's too thick, it could prevent that COP from swinging out. By code, they can bust out that floor on site to make sure that they can access that COP. I've seen that happen. There was a facility that we used to service, and they had went in and put in some sort of tile, and it came about a quarter to a half inch too tall, and they were not able to access that COP. They busted it out. They went out to the truck, had to get a hammer, broke out the tile so that they could swing that COP open, because that's where the issue was, and they had to get into it. An elevator inspector would tell them to do the same thing. If they saw it, they'd be like, nope, you have to replace the floor. They could shut it down and not let you access that elevator until it was done. So you've just spent all this money and done this nice project, and congratulations, you get to redo the floor again. So no one wants to kind of encounter that, so just be aware of what height that clearance is, just to prevent any sore spots down the road. This concludes our continuing education course, Giving Elevators a Lift. So thank you, and I think now we will take any questions if anybody has any.
Preston, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. Members of the audience, if you have any questions, now is the time to submit them, as Preston said, and we have one here. What options are available for high-traffic, high vandalism areas like parking garages, apart from the cameras that you talked about? Maybe something that's graffiti resistant.
There actually are graffiti resistant materials out there. You have some that can actually get Sharpie out. Spray paint can be removed from them. There's other applications depending on, you said, like more of a parking garage structure. So I would always go with additional layers of protection. A crash rail is going to be very advantageous. You're definitely going to want panels that are completely sealed in some of those exposed environments. If you're out by the coast or anywhere that can be any kind of outside influence on those panels, if you can get one that's completely sealed, you don't have to worry about moisture getting into your panels, which can blow up those wood cores. Kind of gross, but it happens. You've all been in them, the ones that smell like somebody went to the restroom in them. Another reason you're going to want those panels completely sealed, they're a lot more cleanable. We'll put it that way. I've had universities that's been a big issue in some of their parking structures. But there are materials that are vandal resistant. Nothing is vandal proof that I've seen. Even in prisons, they try to just do diamond plate material, and they can still tear those up. So there is no perfect cab for that, but there's a lot of different areas of protection that you can add. I would always recommend doing a textured metal if you're worried about those scratches. And then if somebody reaches out to us, we can kind of address other materials that we offer as a company as well for those. Great.
Again, members of the audience, if you've got questions, now is the time to submit them. Preston, here's a question. Do you have to get inside the elevator hoistway to install a cab interior or handrail?
No. Everything is done internal in the cab except the ceiling. The ceiling, yes, you will have to access the hoistway. All the lighting is going to be located on top of the cab itself. So aside from a ceiling, inside ceiling, you're definitely going to have to access that hoistway. Also, there are some handrails that are through-bolted, so those are going to be accessed from the hoistway. If you ever encounter those types and you go to replace them, you're going to find that it's actually more cost-effective to cut those handrails out and replace them with a handrail that is accessed from the interior side of the elevator versus paying someone to come out and get behind the elevator cab to remove those. It's going to be an arm and a leg to have somebody come out there to do that. It's better to just cut it loose and go with a new rail. They're pretty inexpensive when you look at the grand scheme of a elevator project.
Okay. If I'm under contract with an elevator service company, do I have to use them to upgrade my cab?
It should be no, unless there's specific language in there stating that any cab alteration must be done through us, which I've still never seen one that says that. No, you do not have to go with them. If you're doing mechanical upgrades, yeah, you're going to want to stick with somebody that is under contract. Usually that is written in their language that if you have somebody else come perform any kind of upgrades on their mechanical equipment, then that'll either void their warranty or that they will not be responsible for any issues moving forward from that point.
Great. A couple other questions here. What are things to keep in mind if considering installing display monitors or TVs inside elevators?
Good question. You need to make sure that they're actually elevator compliant. There are companies out there that make monitors specifically for the elevator environment. So, these elevators are going up and down at certain rates of speed. They have to be able to kind of handle that without the distortion. So you can't just go to Walmart and buy one on Black Friday and stick it in your elevator. It's not going to work. With that being said, also, you're going to want professionals involved in that, no doubt. Something to be aware of is in the traveling cable. That's where the electronics kind of get their power up and down the hoistway to the cab. You may have to have a certain type of fiber optic cable put into that traveling cable to get those video requirements that you need. Some newer ones will already have those wires included, but if you have an older one that you're trying to upgrade, you may be looking at an additional cost of having to buy a traveling cable, which can be several $1,000s as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question here. We've been making minor upgrades as we run into issues. At what point do we need a full replacement upgrade? Ours is about 25 years old.
For something like that, you're probably going to have to rely on your service company to come out there and give you a full evaluation of your equipment. Obviously, that's not something I can answer without looking at it, but they should be able to give you a capital planner of here's what life expectancy you have left on these certain components. Usually it's going to be your big ticket items. It's whether you have a jack or not, if it's a hydraulic or traction elevator. So your controllers, your door operators, your pump unit, those are going to be some of those big ones that you can do along the way and then have a full upgrade in the end. So there's really you have to do a complete upgrade at once unless your elevator is just completely shot. You can stage it in those phases, which sounds like you're doing, which you might be doing the right thing. But I would get my elevator company out there. If for some reason you don't trust them, I always hear a lot of bad things about the elevator companies just because it is a very expensive market. Get a second opinion. Have somebody else come in there and do an evaluation on it. There's also a lot of elevator consultants out there. Search your area. There's several different companies out there that would be happy to come over there and take a look and help you go through that process. They can assess every aspect of it. They'll get on top of the cabs, inside the cabs, and help you write out exactly the plan you need.
Okay. Well, Preston, thank you very much for your time. This has been a very informative presentation. Members of the audience, thank you for your questions and your attendance. And with that, we'll close the webinar.
Everybody have a great day. Thank you.